It was an ordinary day at the hospital, or at least it seemed that way. Staff were rushing through their rounds, patients were in their rooms, and the usual hum of activity filled the air. But for one doctor, everything was about to change in a way that no one could have predicted. The hospital had been buzzing with whispers about an upcoming promotion. A position had opened up, and many thought they knew who would get it. After all, the candidate had been with the hospital for years, had an impeccable record, and had demonstrated extraordinary commitment to the care of patients. Yet, when the announcement was made, it wasn't him. The news sent shockwaves through the staff. How could someone so deserving not get the promotion? The doctor, who had given everything to this hospital, who had saved lives, worked countless hours, and earned the respect of his colleagues, was left stunned and confused. He had always followed the rules, worked hard, and done what was expected. But despite all of that, he was passed over. What happened? What was the real reason behind the decision? As the days went by, the whispers turned into rumors, and people began to talk. Was it a case of favoritism? Did someone higher up have personal biases that influenced the decision? Or was there something deeper at play here that no one could see? The doctor knew he had to get answers. But what he did next would leave everyone, from the staff to the hospital administrators, completely shocked. It wasn't long before the doctor called a meeting with the hospital's top executives, the ones who had made the decision to deny him the promotion. As he walked into the meeting room, everyone expected the usual confrontation. The doctor had always been calm, composed, and professional, but this time there was something different about him. He wasn't just angry or disappointed. He was determined. With the room full of high-ranking officials, the doctor stood tall and started to speak. His words were measured, but there was a fire in his eyes. What came next stunned everyone into silence. He didn't just reveal how he felt about being passed over for the promotion. He revealed something much, much more. Something that no one had expected and that would change everything in the hospital from that moment on. As he spoke, the room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The doctor's revelation was not just a statement of personal frustration. It was a declaration of something much larger. Something that exposed the truth about the hidden dynamics within the hospital and how far things could really go when power, politics, and discrimination were involved. The faces in the room turned pale as the gravity of his words began to sink in. The shock wasn't just in what he said, but in what he revealed next. Something that, if true, would shake the very foundation of the hospital and everyone who worked there. He had been quietly gathering evidence, compiling records, and observing the system from a perspective that no one else had. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was clear that this doctor wasn't going down without a fight. But what was this big reveal? What had he discovered that was so explosive, so crucial, that it would change everything? As the tension built, all eyes were on him. The room held its breath, waiting for the bombshell to drop. Would this revelation be the turning point that would restore justice and fairness to the hospital? Or would it open a door to a new set of challenges and even more obstacles? Stay tuned, because what comes next is something you won't want to miss. The truth is about to be unveiled, and with it, a new chapter in the story of this doctor's career, one that no one could have seen coming. The doctor's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each executive, each individual who had played a part in this promotion decision. There was no sign of recognition, no flicker of understanding from anyone at the table. They were all still processing what had just been revealed to them. No one knew what to expect next, but the doctor was just getting started. His calm demeanor betrayed the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't just about a missed opportunity, it was about something far more significant. He took a deep breath and glanced down at the papers in front of him, papers that held the evidence of everything he had been silently gathering for months. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. The silence was oppressive, and the doctor knew that the longer he waited to speak, the heavier the weight of the moment would become. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "I've been here for years," he said, his eyes never leaving the group of hospital leaders. "And during that time, I've worked harder than anyone here. I've dedicated myself to this hospital, to the patients, to the staff. I've followed the rules, I've been a team player. But I've also seen things. Things that many people would prefer to ignore. I've been paying attention, and it's become clear that there's a pattern here, a pattern of bias and favoritism." The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them already knowing where this conversation was going. But none of them expected what was coming next. "Let me make this clear," the doctor continued. "I'm not just talking about a simple oversight or a momentary lapse in judgment. This isn't about a promotion. It's about how this hospital operates, how the people in power here make decisions, and who gets to benefit from those decisions. I've seen too many capable, talented individuals get overlooked, simply because they didn't fit the mold of what some of you wanted them to be. And now, I'm going to expose it." The doctor paused, and the weight of his words hung in the air. He knew the executives were starting to realize just how serious he was. They had no idea that he had been watching them so closely. They had no idea that, while they were focused on their power struggles and internal politics, the doctor had been quietly collecting the pieces of a much larger puzzle. "I've gone through every promotion decision for the last 5 years," he said, flipping through the papers in front of him. "I've reviewed the records, the evaluations, the recommendations. And there's one thing that stands out above all else, a consistent pattern of discrimination. Minority candidates, especially African American doctors, are being passed over for promotions, despite outperforming their peers in every measurable way." A murmur spread through the room. Some of the executives shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. The doctor's words had hit home, but the full extent of what he was accusing them of wasn't yet clear. Some of them could hardly believe what they were hearing. How had it gone unnoticed for so long? Was he exaggerating? Was this some kind of personal vendetta? "You're accusing us of discrimination?" one of the executives asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's a serious accusation." "I'm not accusing," the doctor said, his tone calm but unwavering. "I'm simply stating the facts. And I've got the numbers to prove it." He handed over the stack of papers in front of him, each page filled with statistics, comparisons, and analysis. It wasn't just a collection of his opinions, it was evidence, concrete proof of what he was claiming. The room fell into silence again as the executives flipped through the pages, their faces growing more and more tense as they read. The numbers were undeniable. There were patterns, clear, unmistakable patterns of bias. African American doctors were not only being passed over for promotions, but they were also receiving fewer opportunities for leadership roles, fewer chances to prove themselves, and fewer resources to succeed. At the same time, their white colleagues, some of whom had less experience or lower performance metrics, were being promoted, offered better opportunities, and given more support. The doctor had painstakingly documented it all. As the executives read through the documents, the room seemed to shrink. The air grew thick with tension, and the doctor could sense that he had their full attention now. This wasn't just about a missed promotion anymore. This was about a systemic issue, one that had been silently festering for years. And now, it was about to be exposed. "I've also talked to the staff," the doctor continued. "I've spoken to the nurses, the medical technicians, the administrative staff. They know what's going on here. They see the favoritism, the way decisions are made behind closed doors. They see how the minority doctors are treated differently, how their contributions are undervalued. And they're tired of it. They're scared to speak up because they know that doing so might cost them their jobs, but they've seen what I've seen. They've felt what I've felt." The executives were quiet now, unable to refute the evidence in front of them. This was no longer a matter of personal opinion, it was a matter of institutional failure. The doctor had brought the truth to light, and now they had to face it. But even as the doctor spoke, he could feel the unease growing in the room. The executives were nervous, but they were also calculating. How would they handle this? How could they dismiss these allegations without causing a public scandal? They knew that the longer they dragged their feet, the harder it would be to salvage their reputations. One of the executives, a senior vice president, finally broke the silence. "This is a serious issue," he said, his voice low and measured. "But these accusations, if true, could have severe consequences for the hospital. We need to investigate this further, to ensure that the integrity of our processes is maintained." The doctor nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. "I've already done the investigation," he said. "What you need to do now is acknowledge what's been happening here. You need to take responsibility and fix it. Otherwise, this hospital will continue to be a place where best and brightest are overlooked, simply because of the color of their skin." The tension in the room was palpable now. The executives had no easy way out. They could try to cover up the issue, deny the evidence, or deflect blame, but that would only lead to more problems. The doctor had put them in a position where they had to act. They couldn't ignore him. They couldn't pretend like everything was fine. But just as they were about to respond, the doctor stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, and everyone looked up, surprised by his sudden movement. He turned to face the door, but before he left, he said one final thing. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice firm. "You may have thought that this hospital was untouchable, that your power and influence could protect you. But I've got the truth on my side. And I'm not going to stop until the changes are made." With that, the doctor walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned group of executives who were now faced with a dilemma they hadn't anticipated. They knew that this was no longer just about one doctor's promotion. This was about the future of the entire hospital, and whether it could continue to operate under guise of fairness and equality. As the doctor stepped into a hallway, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had made his point, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, there would be backlash, and there would be people who would try to discredit him, to silence him. But Doctor was ready for it. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. In the coming days, the hospital would be forced to confront its ugly truth, and the doctor would be at the center of it all. The question was, how far would they go to protect their secrets? Would they make the changes necessary to fix the system, or would they try to bury the truth once and for all? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, this hospital would never be the same again. And neither would the doctor who had brought its darkest secrets to light. The doctor's footsteps echoed down the sterile hospital corridor, each step louder than the last, as he walked toward the elevator. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but his expression remained unchanged, calm, controlled. Inside, however, he was anything but composed. He had just dropped a bombshell in that meeting, one that threatened to unravel everything the hospital leadership had carefully constructed. But as much as it felt like a victory, he knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge was what came next. He reached the elevator, stepped inside, and pressed the button for the parking garage. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, and he couldn't help but think about all the other doctors just like him who had been passed over, ignored, or dismissed. He wasn't the only one carrying this weight, and he knew that now, more than ever, he had to keep pushing. The road ahead would be dangerous, and it would require allies. But question was, who could he trust? Meanwhile, back in the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The executives were still reeling from the doctor's revelation. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed. Each one of them had a different response to what had just transpired. Some were angry, defensive, trying to figure out a way to salvage their positions and spin the situation. Others were fearful, realizing that their power, perhaps even their careers, was on the line. And a few were simply silent, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. The vice president who had spoken earlier, the one who had suggested an investigation, now looked uneasy. He had always prided himself on maintaining control, on being able to handle any crisis that came his way. But this was different. This wasn't a simple public relations issue or a scandal they could sweep under the rug. This was systemic, deeply rooted in the culture of the hospital. The doctor had opened a can of worms, and now they had to decide how to close it. But there was another problem. The doctor hadn't just walked out. He had left something behind, a sense of power, an undeniable force that lingered in the air. The executives knew that his next move was coming, and they could feel the weight of that impending action. They couldn't ignore this. The doctor wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every minority doctor, nurse, and staff member who had ever been sidelined, pushed aside, or overlooked. Back in the hospital, the news of the doctor's bold revelation quickly spread. Whispers filled the hallways, and within hours, staff members from every department began to talk. There were murmurs of support for the doctor, especially from the younger, less established staff who saw themselves in his struggle. They had all been watching, some quietly, others more openly, as the hospital leadership made decisions that seemed to favor those with the right connections, the right backgrounds, or the right skin color. They had seen their colleagues, hardworking and brilliant, miss out on opportunities time and time again. But none had dared to speak out as the doctor had. The staff were divided, however. While many were emboldened by his courage, others were wary. What would happen next? Would the hospital retaliate against him? Would they try to silence him? Would his actions result in change, or would they simply be another failed attempt at exposing the flaws of a broken system? The hospital had been a place where the powerful stayed powerful, and the doctor had just shaken that system to its core. Now, everyone had to wonder if they would be swept up in the storm that was bound to follow. In a small break room on one of the upper floors, a nurse sat with her coffee cup, staring out the window, her mind racing. She had worked alongside the doctor for years, admired his skill, his compassion, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. She had heard the whispers, the subtle slights, and the way the higher-ups spoke about him when they thought no one was listening. She had seen how he was overlooked for promotions, how others were given the benefit of the doubt, while he was constantly expected to prove himself. But despite all that, he had kept working, kept giving, kept showing up. But today was different. Today, he had spoken out. And that changed everything. She put her coffee down and stood up, a decision forming in her mind. The doctor couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, and she was ready to be one of them. But the question was, how far was she willing to go? If she spoke up, would she be putting her career on the line? Would she be targeted, isolated, or even fired? The risks were real, and they weren't small. But the injustice was greater. She couldn't stand by and let it continue. The next few days were a whirlwind of uncertainty. The hospital's response to the doctor's allegations was slow, cautious, and decidedly noncommittal. They promised to investigate, to look into the claims, but the staff knew the truth. Investigations like these often amounted to nothing more than a temporary bandage on a festering wound. The doctor had put them in a difficult position, one where they couldn't easily deny what had been laid out before them. But how could they respond without undermining their authority? How could they admit fault without losing face? As the days dragged on, the doctor received unexpected visitors. Several of his colleagues, fellow doctors and nurses, quietly approached him with support. They expressed their admiration for his courage, for standing up in a system that had long been flawed. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid of being overheard by hospital administrators or colleagues who might report them. It was clear that the doctor wasn't alone in his frustrations, but the fear of retribution still loomed large. One evening, the nurse who had been reflecting on the doctor's actions in the break room found herself standing at the entrance to his office. She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had to do this for herself, for her colleagues, and for the patients who were unknowingly caught in the middle of this battle. She knocked softly on the door, and when the doctor called out to enter, she stepped inside. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low but steady. "I want to help. I don't know what the next step is, but I can't sit back and watch this happen." The doctor looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice calm. "But this isn't something you can just help with. This is going to get messy. People will come after you. You could lose everything." She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know. But this has gone on long enough. I can't pretend it's not happening. I can't keep working here, pretending everything's fine when I know it's not." They exchanged a brief, understanding look. The doctor wasn't sure where this would lead, but one thing was clear: this nurse, like so many others, was tired of the silence. And maybe, just maybe, together, they could make a difference. But as the doctor prepared to step into the next phase of his fight, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The hospital might have been shaken, but the true test was how far the leadership was willing to go to maintain control. Would they silence him and protect their own? Or would they face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, and work toward real change? One thing was certain: the outcome of this battle would reverberate through the hospital for years to come. And the doctor was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital's response, or lack thereof, became more unsettling by the day. The doctor's initial revelation had ignited a fire, but that fire was quickly met with cold silence. The promises of an internal investigation seemed to be fading into the background, overshadowed by the growing tension. Every time the doctor passed through the corridors, he noticed the hushed conversations, the sideways glances. There was fear in the air, but also a glimmer of something else: hope. People were watching, waiting to see if he would break, if he would retreat, if the system would win. But the doctor wasn't going to back down. One evening, just after his shift ended, the doctor received a call. His stomach dropped when he saw the hospital's head administrator on the screen. His pulse quickened, and the weight of the conversation hit him even before he answered. The administrator, who had been noticeably absent during the earlier stages of the controversy, wanted a meeting. No explanation. Just a time and place. It was clear that whatever was about to unfold, it wouldn't be simple. The doctor arrived at the meeting room just as the sun was beginning to set. The room was cold, sterile, its bright lights casting sharp shadows across the walls. He took a seat across from the administrator, who seemed even more composed than usual, his demeanor cool and distant. "You've caused quite a stir," the administrator said, his voice calm but firm. "The allegations you've brought to light, they're troubling. But the way you've handled it? It's not the way we do things here. You've disrupted the peace, and now we have to figure out how to move forward." The doctor didn't flinch. "I didn't cause the problems. I just exposed them." The administrator sighed, adjusting his glasses. "We both know that change is difficult, especially in a place like this. But if you want to continue working here, you need to understand that there's a way to approach these things. Public confrontation only damages reputations. Yours, mine, the hospital's. We can still work this out privately. If you retract your statements, we'll consider this matter closed. You'll be given the promotion you deserve, and everything can go back to normal." The offer hung in the air, like a heavy weight. But the doctor knew exactly what was being asked of him: silence. Cooperation. A surrender. It wasn't a solution, it was a way to bury the truth. He had seen how this hospital operated, how those in power took care of their own and buried those who didn't fit the mold. And he refused to be part of that system any longer. "No," the doctor said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." The administrator's expression tightened, his fingers drumming against the table. "I'm warning you. You think you're standing up for something bigger, but you don't realize the storm you're inviting. If you push this further, it's not just your career at risk, it's your reputation, your livelihood. Everything." The doctor stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Then I'll face it head on. I didn't start this, but I'm sure as hell going to finish it." He turned to walk out, but the administrator's voice called after him, low and dangerous. "We'll see how long your resolve lasts. You won't be the only one affected by your actions." As the door slammed behind him, the doctor's heart raced, but he wasn't afraid. He had made his choice. The fight had become personal, not just for his promotion, but for every person who had ever been overlooked, sidelined, and silenced in the name of power and control. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing anymore, it was a battleground. And he had no intention of losing. The following days felt like a pressure cooker, each passing hour bringing more tension. The administration was putting increasing pressure on staff to take sides, and whispers began to turn into quiet threats. Some doctors and nurses were pulling away, distancing themselves from the controversy, while others were reaching out to the doctor, offering support, but all too afraid to take the first step publicly. The doctor knew it wouldn't be enough to keep fighting alone. He needed more than just moral support. He needed people in positions of influence to take action, people who weren't afraid of the system, who were willing to risk it all. And he found them, slowly but surely. A handful of his colleagues, those who had been quietly dissatisfied for years, began to rally behind him. They weren't just talking about the problems anymore, they were ready to expose them. But even as they began to mobilize, the hospital was fighting back. Behind the scenes, the administrators were moving quickly. They started gathering dirt on the doctor, sending anonymous complaints to colleagues, questioning his abilities, painting him as a disruptive force, a liability. The threat wasn't just to his career, it was an all-out smear campaign. They were willing to destroy his credibility if it meant silencing him. The doctor knew the stakes had never been higher. He wasn't just battling for a promotion anymore. He was fighting for truth, for fairness, and for the future of everyone who had been overlooked for too long. But the question remained, would the system bend, or would it break him before he had a chance to see it change? Late one night, as he was going through his notes and preparing for the next confrontation, a knock came at his door. His heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment, expecting that someone would finally come forward with information that could tip the scales. But what he didn't expect was the person standing in front of him when he opened the door. A familiar face, someone he never thought would take a stand. A senior administrator, one who had remained neutral until now, had come to deliver a message. But the look in their eyes, the unease, told him everything he needed to know. Something big was about to happen, and it would either be the turning point or the moment it all fell apart. As the doctor stood in the doorway, staring at the senior administrator, his mind raced, trying to process the unexpected visitor. The administrator was usually one of the most quiet, calculated figures within the hospital's upper ranks. To see them here, at this hour, felt like a turning point, one that could either destroy everything he had worked for, or spark the change he had longed to see. The administrator hesitated, shifting uneasily on their feet. It wasn't the usual cold professionalism that the doctor had come to expect from them. This time, there was something else in their eyes: guilt. Fear. "I need to talk to you," the administrator finally said, their voice barely above a whisper. "It's about the investigation. The promotion. Everything." The doctor's heart pounded. What was this? Was it a confession? Or was the hospital finally making its move to crush him once and for all? "You've got 5 minutes," he replied, his tone sharp but measured. He wasn't sure whether he could trust this person, but he knew there was no time to waste. The administrator nodded, and they stepped into the room, shutting the door quietly behind them. They hesitated again, clearly struggling with something. "You've been right about everything," they started, finally looking him in the eye. "But you're not the only one who's been trying to expose what's really been going on here." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? Who else?" The administrator's voice dropped lower, and for a moment, the doctor thought they might be ready to make a bold admission. But then the administrator spoke again, their words a little too rushed. "I wasn't supposed to say anything, but you're not the only one the hospital's been hiding. There's someone high up in the board who has been pulling strings behind the scenes. They've been controlling the promotion process. And they've been hiding a lot more than that." The doctor's mind spun, his stomach churning with the realization that the corruption wasn't just a few individuals in the hospital, it was far more systemic than he had ever imagined. "Who is it?" he demanded. "Who's behind all of this?" The administrator seemed to freeze, their face going pale. I can't say. But they know about you. They know you're on the verge of uncovering everything, and they won't stop until you're silenced." The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. The doctor's instinct told him this was no simple admission of guilt, something much bigger was at play. "What do you mean silenced? You're telling me that this goes all the way to the board?" The administrator nodded, and for a moment they looked away, almost as if ashamed. "Yes. The system is rigged. And now they're making their move. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you never get the promotion. Or the justice you're fighting for. And they've already started to turn the tables." The doctor felt the weight of the words crashing down on him. The stakes had just been raised. Not only was he fighting against the hospital's administration, but now he was up against a hidden, powerful force that would stop at nothing to destroy his career and possibly even his future in medicine. He suddenly felt like the walls were closing in. Every step he had taken had led him to this point, but now, it seemed like every move would be watched, every word he said would be scrutinized. The fight for truth and fairness had become more than just a battle for a promotion, it was now a fight for his very survival in a system that would stop at nothing to keep its secrets buried. Before the doctor could respond, the administrator quickly added, "I'm not here to harm you. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the danger you're in. You need to get out now, while you still can." "Out?" The doctor shook his head. "I'm not backing down. I'm not going to run. You don't understand, I can't. There are too many people who've suffered because of this. Too many who've been overlooked, ignored, pushed aside." The administrator's face darkened, and they leaned in closer, lowering their voice. "That's exactly why you need to walk away. You're a threat to them now. They've made sure that no one ever goes up against them and wins. They'll destroy you if they have to." The doctor's pulse quickened. His every instinct screamed at him to push forward, to fight harder than ever, but the warning from the administrator kept gnawing at him. This wasn't just about making noise anymore. It wasn't just about a promotion or the recognition he deserved. He had unwittingly become the target of a deep, dangerous conspiracy, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of the hospital, reaching into the very foundations of the healthcare system. "I can't back down," the doctor said, his voice firm despite the growing doubt that gnawed at him. "If I walk away now, everything I've worked for is a lie. I'm not just fighting for myself anymore, I'm fighting for everyone who's been shut out, ignored, and left behind." The administrator stared at him, their expression conflicted. For a moment, they seemed to wrestle with their own internal battle. "You don't understand what you're up against," they said again, almost pleading. "You've already become a target. You're too close to the truth." The doctor clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He had no choice now. He had come too far to stop. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they weren't falling the way he expected. With every revelation, it became clearer this was bigger than a promotion. This was a war for control, for power, and for the truth. The administrator seemed to sense the determination in the doctor's eyes, and for the first time, they backed away slightly. "I'm sorry," they said, almost as if they had failed him. "But you're in this alone now. There's nothing more I can do." The door closed behind them, leaving the doctor standing in the center of the room, his mind reeling from the weight of what had just been revealed. His worst fears were coming true, but there was no turning back now. The hospital, the board, the system, he was going to take them all on. But as he stood there in the silence, the reality began to sink in. This was only the beginning. The true fight was just about to start. The doctor stood there in the dimly lit office, the silence enveloping him like a heavy fog. His thoughts were racing, the weight of everything that had been said settling deep in his chest. There was no turning back now. He had to face what lay ahead, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged, overlooked, or silenced by a system that valued power over integrity. As he walked out of the office, the hospital's once familiar corridors now felt like a labyrinth full of danger, lies, and untold truths. He had one final meeting scheduled for the day, one that would change everything. The boardroom. The very place where his future had been decided, and where, he now realized, the strings had been pulled by forces much darker than he ever anticipated. As he walked toward the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. He had no idea who he could trust, but he was certain of one thing: the time for secrets was over. Inside the boardroom, the top executives were already seated, their expressions cold and unreadable. He was led to the table, and without a word, they handed him the promotion offer he had been denied time and again. The same one they had told him was out of his reach. The very same one that had been used to manipulate him, to push him to the edge, hoping he'd break under the pressure. They thought he would give in, that the fight would exhaust him, but they were wrong. He took the offer, flipping it over slowly, his mind racing. He knew something was off. They had expected him to be thrilled, to jump at the chance to accept the promotion. But he wasn't fooled anymore. He had already made up his mind about what he needed to do, what he had to expose. The system couldn't stay the same. Not after everything he had uncovered. But as he looked at the faces around the table, the weight of his next words hung in the air. "I'm not here for your offer," he said, his voice calm, yet the room felt deathly quiet. "I'm here to make sure the truth comes out." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. "What truth?" one of them asked, but there was a nervous edge to their voice that betrayed their calm faade. The doctor stood tall, every inch of him now radiating the confidence that had been hard-won over the past few weeks. The truth about the corruption. The manipulation of the promotion process. The hidden agendas that have kept talented, deserving people like myself from moving forward, he said, his voice unwavering. The room was tense, but there was something else brewing beneath the surface. The power in the room shifted, and the doctor could feel it. It was no longer a battle for recognition, it was a battle for control, for the very future of the hospital. He was no longer just a victim of the system, he had become its fiercest opponent. Just as the tension reached its peak, the doors of the boardroom swung open, and in walked the hospital's highest-ranking official. The same person who had remained behind the scenes, pulling the strings, orchestrating everything. The very person the doctor had been warned about. The room froze. Everyone stood in shocked silence as the official walked toward the table, their presence undeniable. "I see you've figured it out," the official said, their voice dripping with cold authority. But as they spoke, something in their eyes flickered. Fear, perhaps? Regret? The doctor couldn't tell, but it wasn't enough to make him falter. This was it. This was the final confrontation. For a moment, neither side spoke. The doctor's heart raced as he prepared for the truth to finally break free. But just as he opened his mouth to expose the entire operation, the official raised a hand, signaling for silence. They reached into their briefcase and pulled out a file. It was thick, heavy with the weight of secrets. "You think you've uncovered everything?" the official said, locking eyes with him. "You've barely scratched the surface." With a single motion, they tossed the file onto the table. The doctor hesitated, unsure whether he should open it. But before he could, the official continued. "This hospital, this system, it's not just a few bad apples. It's been built on layers of deception, going back decades. The corruption runs so deep, even the highest powers have been involved. And you've just become a pawn in a much larger game." The doctor felt his chest tighten, a cold chill running down his spine. He had been so focused on exposing the wrongs, he hadn't realized the scale of what he was dealing with. The fight for his promotion, for his career, was just one part of a much larger, far more sinister puzzle. And now, it seemed like he was trapped in a game he couldn't possibly win. The doctor's hand hovered over the file, trembling. As he opened it, he was greeted with a chilling revelation. Names, dates, documents, proof of deep corruption that reached far beyond the hospital. It wasn't just a fight for promotion, it was a war for control over the healthcare system itself. And the doctor, in his attempt to seek justice, had stumbled upon something far bigger and more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. But just as he was about to digest the magnitude of what he had uncovered, the official's phone buzzed. They checked it quickly, their eyes widening with shock. "It started," they muttered under their breath. The tension in the room escalated as the officials began exchanging hurried whispers. The doctor's mind raced. What did they mean by "it started"? Was this the beginning of something even worse? Before he could speak, the official looked up, their face pale. "You've made a terrible mistake," they said, their voice barely audible. "You don't know who you've crossed. It's too late now." The doctor felt the weight of their words sink in. This wasn't over. It had never been about a promotion, and it certainly wasn't about justice. It was about survival. The doors to the boardroom slammed shut. And that's when the real fight began. The doctor felt the intensity of the moment. The doors were locked, and the officials around him were now more than just figures of authority, they were adversaries, part of a system that had been hiding its rot for far too long. The weight of their final words sank into his chest like a stone. "It's too late now." As they stood there, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. The silence was suffocating, and the doctor's heart pounded in his ears. But despite the fear that was creeping up his spine, he stood firm. He'd come this far, uncovered the truth, and he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he'd endured. The official's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know who you've crossed." But it didn't make sense. Who were they referring to? He'd been focused on his own battle, on the injustice of being denied the promotion he had earned, but this was something else. Something darker. Something larger. He glanced down at the file, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. The documents were clear, the proof undeniable. He had exposed the corruption within the hospital's promotion system. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The files revealed connections to powerful figures, political influence, money, and a web of secrets stretching beyond the hospital's walls. It wasn't just about a promotion, it was about control, about power being manipulated for the benefit of a select few. The doctor's mind raced. The stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. He wasn't just fighting for his career now. He was fighting for the future of the entire healthcare system, for the people who had been systematically silenced and oppressed for far too long. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies. In that moment, the door to the boardroom creaked open again, and the official entered, this time with a different air about them. They were no longer the powerful figure they had been moments ago. Now they seemed hesitant, almost vulnerable. They looked at the doctor, and for the first time, their eyes were not filled with anger or arrogance. Instead, there was a flicker of fear. "You don't understand what you're up against," they said quietly, their voice softer than before. "This isn't just about a promotion or corruption. There are forces at play that you can't even begin to comprehend." The doctor's pulse quickened. What did they mean? Who was behind all of this? The official reached into their pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted phone. They glanced at it briefly before turning their gaze back to the doctor. "You think you've uncovered everything," they continued, "but you've only uncovered a small part of it. The rest? It's far more dangerous than you could imagine. You've made enemies powerful enemies." The room seemed to close in on him. His instincts told him to leave, to get out before it was too late, but his resolve kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had uncovered. Not when the stakes were so high. "I've already uncovered enough," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "The public needs to know the truth." The official's face tightened, and they seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "You think you can expose this? You can't. You don't have the resources, the power, or the protection you think you do. You've only scratched the surface, and now they'll come for you." The doctor felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't flinch. He had come too far to turn back. He had already made his decision. He would take down the system, no matter the cost. With a sudden movement, the officials slammed their fist onto the table. "I warned you," they hissed. "There's no going back now. They won't just destroy you. They'll destroy everything you care about." The doctor's mind raced. Who were these they the official spoke of? Who was behind this conspiracy? What was the full extent of the corruption he had uncovered? But before he could ask another question, the official turned sharply and walked toward the door. "You'll find out soon enough," they muttered under their breath. "You're already too deep." And with that they were gone, leaving the doctor alone in the cold, silent room. The weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He was in over his head. The promotion, the corruption, it was all part of something much bigger, and now he was entangled in a battle far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, he couldn't back down. He couldn't let fear stop him. As he walked out of the boardroom, he knew that his life had just taken a turn he could never have predicted. The fight was no longer about the promotion. It was about exposing the truth, about bringing down the forces that had held power for far too long. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risks were greater than he could comprehend. But he had no choice. He had to keep going. The phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an unknown number. He answered it, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not the only one who's been digging," a voice on the other end said. "I know what you found. And I'm on your side." The doctor's breath caught in his throat. Who was this? And how did they know what he had uncovered? "Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. It's time to finish what you started." The line went dead, leaving the doctor standing in the middle of the hallway, his mind racing. He didn't know who this person was or what they had planned, but he knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over. As he made his way to the docks, the gravity of the situation hit him again. The web of corruption he had uncovered was far larger and more complex than he could have ever imagined. The forces at play weren't just in the hospital, they were everywhere, pulling the strings of the healthcare system, manipulating the very foundation of the profession he had devoted his life to. When he arrived at the warehouse, the door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped out from the darkness. The figure was tall, their features obscured by the dim light. They motioned for the doctor to come inside. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, ready to confront whatever came next. The figures spoke, their voice low and serious. What you've uncovered is just the beginning. There's a much larger game being played here. And now you're part of it. The doctor's heart skipped a beat. He had been right to keep going. The fight was bigger than just him. It was about exposing the system, about taking down the powerful forces that had controlled everything from the shadows. And as he looked into the figure's eyes, he knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, a battle for justice, for truth, and for the future of the healthcare system. There was no turning back now.